We begin this video with a trip cost splitter. This is a program which takes in some information from the trip and splits the cost among the number of people who went for the trip. So let's run this program and let's see how its output looks like. So it asks for trip names. So let's say it's an excursion. Number of people, there were 6 people on board and the total cost was $1,500 with a 20% tip percentage. And then it does its calculation. It says trip, excursion, people 6, subtotal 1,500, tip 20%, which is $300, grand total 1,800. So each person pays $300. By the end of this video, you should be able to build something like this. Stay with me till the end. We begin by creating a new file. Okay, so far every program we have written has fixed data. I hard coded a name or a number and the program runs. But real programs do talk to the users. They ask questions and wait for answers. That's what input does. Consider this code. Name equals inputs. By saying name equals inputs, I am requesting an information from the user. So in this parenthesis, I have to put in some information about the data I want to collect from the user. So let's say I want to request the name of the user. Then I'm going to do enter your name. Once I do this, it means this string is telling the user which particular information I want to collect from him. This input function gives our program the ability to take in data from the user and put that data into our work. So let's say I decide to print the value for name and run this code. If I hit run, I'm going to have enter your name. So my program requests me to enter a name. So let's say I say Kofi and I hit enter. So you see Kofi is printed to the user. And the reason Kofi was printed is because on the second line I said print name. So this confirms that indeed Kofi was taken as an input, stored in the variable called name, and now exists in our program. Input does two things. It shows your prompt text on the screen. And here my prompt text is enter your name, and then it waits until the user types in something and presses enter. Now here's the most important thing about input. It always returns a string. There are no exceptions. So let's say I wanted to take in the age of an individual and I wanted to increment the age by 1. So this time, instead of enter your name, I say enter your age. If I run this program, it's going to crash. And the reason is input always accepts or input always takes in a string. So if I pass an integer as my input, the function here is going to convert that integer into a string. So on the second line when I say print age plus 1, it means I'm trying to add a string and an integer, and that's going to make my program crash. Let's run this and let's see our outputs. So it says enter your age, so let me say 18, and the program crashes because can only concatenate a string to a string, not an integer. So the best thing we can do is to convert the string into the integer. That's called typecasting. So I just say int before the input. So what happens is we print enter your age to the user, we take in an input, and after we take in that input, we convert that input into an integer. Now let's run this code again. So this time I say 18 and I have 19. Okay, we could confirm. Okay, that one is out. Awesome. Okay, now let's say we want to take the height of an individual. So for heights, heights are not measured in integers, but rather in decimal values. So what do you think is going to be the function for the typecasting? Float, because floats in Python store decimal values. So instead of int, I'm going to say, so now let me print the heights to the user. So let's say I enter an integer, say 6 or 5. If I hit run, I have 5.0 because I converted whatever input I gave into a float, which is a decimal value. So 5 becomes 5.0, 5.6 becomes 5.6, and so on and so forth. But then if I wanted to receive a string into the data, all I have to do is to go with the input because input by default returns a string. The only case where I'm going to do type conversions is when I want to receive something else of a different data type, such as integers or floating point values. Another thing we could do is to control the print statements. For some time now, we've just been doing print with a variable or print with an f string. Let's say I had number equals 7 divided by 3. So 7 divided by 3 is going to return a decimal. So let me decide to print this. So printing 7 divided by 3, I'm going to have 2.33333, so many decimals. Now let's assume I didn't want the program to output all these decimals. What do I do? It means I have to control my print statement's output, in the sense that I have to limit the number of decimal places that my print statement is going to output. This is referred to as formatting. I'll show you how to do this in a bit. So the best thing we can do is by using f strings. Whenever we want to format, we go by using f strings. So I'll begin with an f as usual, and then my quotes. Then the variable will be placed in curly braces as usual, but this time it doesn't end here. Inside those curly braces, we are going to introduce a colon. After the colon, we then specify the type of format parameters that we want to use. So if it's decimal places that we want, then we are going to go with the F, which represents float. So let's say dot 2F simply means dot 3F simply means to 3 places of decimal. Dot 2F simply means to 2 places of decimal. So let's try dot 2F. If I hit run, I'm going to have 2.33 formatted to 2 places of decimal. Another thing we could do with print statements is this. So let's say I had several objects to print. So 14th June 2026. If I hit run, I'm going to have it printed in this format, 2026 0614. So the default spacing parameter is a space. So between the first item and the second item, we have a space. We could format our print statement so that instead of a space, we are going to use a slash or whatever we want to use as a separator value. In order to do this, I introduce a separate parameter called sep, and I say sep equals, and I give my quotes. So whatever I put in those quotes becomes our separator value. Let's say I wanted to separate with the slash. So I'm just going to put a slash and I'll hit run. And I'm now going to have 26 slash 06 slash 14. Another thing we could do is by using the end statement. So let's say I had two sentences. If I run this, by default, these two sentences will be separated by a new line character. So a new line simply means I print the first statement and I move on to a new line to print the second statement. Let's hit run and let's see our output. The first statement and then a new line to print the second statement. That's a default separator value for two different print statements in Python. I could change that by using what I call the end keyword. So let's say I introduce a second parameter called end, and I say end equals, at this point, I now have to specify the separator value between the first print statement and the second print statement. So I can just use a tab, which is a space, and I say end equals space. So that means after this first sentence prints out, just leave a space and execute the second print function. If I hit run, we are going to have something like this. The two good friends and a space, they pass the test. Okay, at this point, I think you have enough information to build the opening project. Let's begin. So the first thing we are going to do is to print our headers. So our headers is just going to give us some information on the project we want to do. So we'll begin by printing the title of the project. And the title is Trip Cost Splitter. So it's a trip cost splitter. We can begin with something like this. We can begin by creating our borders. And I just copy this. Okay, so if I hit run at this point, this is all we have. Trip cost splitter. Now below this line, we are now going to implement the logic for our program. So what do? We begin by taking information from the user. So in taking the information, I'm going to have the trip name. So the trip name equals an input statement which requests the user to input something. So I would say trip name. So I'm asking the user to input the trip name. And the next thing I'll say is the number of people in the trip. How do I request the number of people in the trip? I just say create a variable called people and assign that variable to the input statements. And in these parentheses, I ask, so how many people went on the trip? Okay, so I ask this question so that I find the total number of people who went on the trip and split the cost across. So total cost equals inputs total cost. Now notice something here. The number of people is returned as a string because I said earlier that input by default returns a string. So to convert the number of people to an integer, we have to do typecasting. So we begin with int to convert whatever inputs I get into an integer. The same thing for the total cost. Total cost is usually stored as a float. So we convert everything to float. Okay, so now I have the trip name, the total number of people, and total cost. So now I'll have to calculate for the trip percentage. That's the percentage we paid as tips to probably the tour guides or something. So our tip percent. So our tip percent equals, we can convert that to float to. So input tip percentage. Okay, notice I should have made this a string because my instruction should be in the form of a string. So now tip percentage. Now this is all data I have to take from the user. We can do some calculations by, calculating the total trip amount where we say total cost plus the actual tip. So, so before we calculate total amount, let's say tip. So the tip equals the tip percentage that we have divided by 100, because if I say 20%, it's equivalent to 20 over 100 in the form of a fraction. And I now multiply this by the total cost. So if I'm given a total cost and I'm given a percentage which constitutes tip, then I can find the tip, the actual amount of the tip. So this is how we get a tip. And my total cost, that's the total amount of the total amount of money we paid becomes our grand total. So now the next thing we do is to proceed to split this grand total across each person who went on that trip. So we say per person equals, so the grand total divided by the number of people. Now we are done. The next thing we have to do is to actually print the results of our analysis or the results of our data processing to the user. How do we do this? We have to print it in a way that's easy to read and easy to understand by the user. So I'll begin by a print statement. So let's begin with our dividers again. So I do something like this to separate my inputs from the outputs. Or I could even say outputs so that the user knows what he's dealing with. Okay. Okay, so now I've successfully separated the inputs from the output side. So the next thing I do is to proceed to actually print the outputs. So I'm going to use F strings throughout because F strings give me the ability to format my outputs. So I begin with trip. So if I say trip and I leave a space, then I have to print out the trip name. How do I do this with F strings? All I have to do is to introduce curly braces and bring in the variable name which holds the trip name. So trip colon curly braces trip name. So this is going to give me the name of the trip. The next thing I have to do is the number of people on board. So also F strings, then I'll just say maybe number of people, um, curly braces, and people, okay. And the next thing, another print statement. So now let's print the subtotal. So our subtotal, so let's say we want to format it in dollars, so we'll put a dollar sign in front. Okay, so our subtotal is the total cost. So I'm going to put my total cost in here. Now, the total cost will be printed as a decimal. Now, this decimal can have as many decimal places as possible. It may be 5, maybe 6, maybe 7. So in order to output this information in a usable way to the user, then it means I have to format the number of decimal places. So let's say I decide to take this to 2 places of decimal because usually for money, you put it in 2 places of decimal. So I just say dot 2f. So that converts my subtotal to 2 places of decimal. Finally, we are going to print something like this. So print with an F string, and we say each person is supposed to pay. So each person is supposed to pay, and I bring my curly braces, and in those curly braces, I put what? Per person. So in those curly braces, I put per person, which is the amount of money each person is supposed to pay. Also formatted to 2 places of decimal. Now notice the point I put before the 2 places of decimal, because decimal numbers are found to the right of the decimal place. So I say dot 2f, which is to 2 places of decimal. I bring my dollar sign, and that would be it for this program. I think so. Yeah. So let's run and let's see how our output looks like. So we say trip name. I'll go with the excursion. So an excursion, how many people went on the trip? Let's say 5. The total cost was 1,000, and the tip percentage, let's say 30%. So it prints out the output, which is trip excursion, number of people 5, subtotal 1,000, tip 300, grand total 1,003. So each person is supposed to pay $260. You can do this calculation and see if it tallies. $260 multiplied by 5, so that's probably going to give you $1,300 as a grand total. So soon we've come to the end of this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about conditional statements, which is if, else, elif statements. So in this video, we'll talk about how to make your program think logically, how to make your program do something if a condition is right, or do another thing if a different condition is right. Okay, so join me on this journey, which is the ML journey. So you can support this journey by subscribing to the channel. See you in the next video.